We were flying straight into a place no one wanted to go, bullets cutting through the air, men calling for help, and no safe way in or out. Orders said stay away, wait for it to calm down. But the wounded didn't have that kind of time. In that moment, it wasn't about protocol or permission. It was about doing what had to be done. And once we made that choice, there was no turning back. We never really kept track of the numbers, and honestly, we didn't care much about counting every single thing. Deep down, we already understood something important. What we were doing, clearing mines here and there, wasn't going to make a massive difference on its own. It didn't take long to realize that eventually someone higher up would figure it out too. That maybe clearing mines needed to become a bigger priority than just mapping. But at that time, mapping was still considered the main mission. I was born and raised in Olympia, Washington. Looking back, it was a great place to grow up. When I was still young, World War II was happening, and the entire community was deeply involved in supporting the war effort. People were proud, patriotic, and everyone felt like they had a role to play. My father served, my uncles served, and I even had a great uncle who lost both of his sons early in the war. He came to live with us later on. Experiences like that stay with you, but I can't say for sure that's what pushed me toward the military. At 15, I joined the National Guard, though not for the reasons you might expect. They had a basketball court, and that caught my attention more than anything else. Of course, there were also artillery exercises, and seeing them fire at targets in the air was fascinating. But the Guard wasn't just military, it was social too. Back then, I was also playing baseball. I made the All-American team even though I was only about 5'6" and weighed around 145 pounds. I was the smallest guy out there, but I still managed to be the cleanup hitter. I figured if I joined the Army, maybe I'd get a chance to keep playing ball. There were some incredible players in the service back then, guys like Ted Williams. That was part of the dream. That dream took a hit pretty quickly, though. I injured my shoulder trying to throw a grenade far enough so the noise wouldn't bother me. I tore my rotator cuff, and just like that, baseball was out of the picture. I didn't exactly enlist. I was drafted at 19. At first, it was only supposed to be 2 years. That was the deal. But things don't always go according to plan. For basic training, they sent me just 12 miles from home, which didn't make much sense. If someone wasn't too excited about being drafted, keeping them that close probably wasn't the best strategy. I told everyone I was heading to Korea, because that's where most people were going at the time. Instead, I ended up at Fort Lewis, and then Fort Worden in Washington, about 47 miles from home. There, I started working with boats, M-boats, and trained for amphibious assaults, similar to what happened during the Incheon invasion. It was serious work, but I also had a first sergeant who saw something different in me and a buddy of mine. He told us straight up that we were too messed up to succeed the usual way, that maybe we'd make corporal someday, and he didn't want that on his conscience. Instead, he pushed us toward officer training. He had us sign the paperwork and basically kicked us out of his unit to go to OCS. We went through leadership school and then officer candidate school, and surprisingly, we both made it through. After that, I went into engineer OCS. Once I graduated, they wanted anyone who was physically fit to head to flight school. At the time, the Corps of Engineers had massive aviation operations, hundreds of pilots based out of places like San Francisco and Panama, doing mapping work all over the world. That's how I ended up flying in some of the most extreme environments you can imagine. I flew in the Arctic using skis and floats, and I flew in the deserts of Libya with the exact same aircraft and gear. We had Arctic sleeping bags, tents, and equipment, no matter where we were. The Army had us doing 2 things at once: mapping terrain and clearing mines. Libya, in particular, was filled with millions of live mines left over from earlier conflicts. In my first year there, our team cleared about 7,000 of them. At one point, the Army wanted us to start documenting every mine we cleared, filling out reports and keeping detailed records. But suddenly, those forms seemed to disappear, and no one was too eager to track it anymore. We knew our small efforts weren't going to solve the larger problem anyway. The real mission, the one that mattered most, was mapping. Without those maps, the oil industry wouldn't have been able to move forward in that region. Oil companies literally followed our path across the desert. They had all the comforts, air-conditioned trailers, freezers, proper meals, while we lived in tents and survived on rations. And while they moved in behind us, they didn't deal with the mines. That part was on us. Around 1959, things shifted for me. I had gotten married a few years earlier, in 1956, and by 59 I was back at Fort Lewis, preparing for an assignment in South America. That was a turning point. It was one of those moments where you had to decide, stay in or get out. My wife supported me completely. She knew how much I loved flying. If I had left the military, I probably would have gone into commercial aviation, starting as a co-pilot and working my way up. But we decided together to stay in and take the assignment. I spent the next couple of years flying across Central and South America, and later we moved to Costa Rica, where we stayed for about 2.5 years. Our youngest son was born there. It was one of the few places outside the US where that was even possible at the time, and it turned out to be a wonderful place to live. Then, in 1965, Vietnam entered the picture. I was in the Dominican Republic when we first started hearing hints about it. Interestingly, the news didn't come from official channels right away. It came through conversations, even something as random as a soldier's wife mentioning it over the radio. Eventually, the official word came down from the Pentagon, and we had to move quickly. I had just 12 days to get my family back to Seattle and return to prepare my unit for deployment. They sent commanders ahead by air so we could get familiar with operations before our units arrived. By that point, we were flying Hueys, D models at first, later upgraded versions. There was also a shift toward using Cobra gunships, which in my opinion wasn't the best decision. The Cobra had only 2 crew members sitting one behind the other in an enclosed space. It was more comfortable, sure, but you lost awareness. In a Huey, you had more people, more visibility, and more ability to respond to incoming fire. You could actually sense what was happening around you. With the Cobra, you could fly over the same hostile area multiple times and not even realize you were being shot at until it was too late. Personally, I'd rather know what's coming at me and have a team that can respond. The Huey setup just made more sense in that kind of environment. At the end of the day, the mission in Vietnam centered around air mobility. By then, we understood what that meant: moving troops quickly, supporting assaults, and adapting to a completely different kind of warfare. That was the stage we were stepping into, whether we were fully ready for it or not. We had already spent a couple of years training in places like the Carolinas and Fort Benning, so we understood the concept of air mobility pretty well. But theory and reality are 2 different things. Once you start taking fire, everything changes. Not completely, but enough that you have to adapt quickly. You learn in real time, and sometimes those lessons come the hard way. When we first got into Vietnam, a lot of our time was wasted building up base camps. Looking back, that effort didn't really help us much. My crew chiefs, clerks, even cooks, everyone was out there cutting brush and clearing land. But when it came time to support infantry operations, I had to take those same people along because I didn't have enough trained door gunners. I was short about 20 men. I had 20 helicopters, 1 jeep, and no proper door gunners assigned when I arrived in country. So I had to improvise. I turned cooks, clerks, even staff officers into temporary door gunners just to make missions possible. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. Eventually, I started getting the personnel I needed, but by then another issue hit us. We went over as a full division, but we didn't stay that way. Within 6 months, I had to send half my unit away to other units, and in return, I'd get replacements from them. By the end of a year, I was often the only original member left from my group. That kind of system destroyed unit cohesion. Back in the States, there wasn't even a real division left to return to. People were scattered everywhere: Panama, engineering assignments, mapping units, or ground roles. There was no structure holding it all together. That approach just didn't work. It looked fine on paper, but in reality it created confusion and weakened leadership. Today we don't do that anymore. Units deploy together and come back together. That way you preserve experience, trust, and structure. What we had back then was the opposite: constant turnover, inexperienced leaders stepping into critical roles, and a lack of continuity that hurt effectiveness for years. As a commander, that system was brutal. I had to send away men I had served with for years, guys I knew personally, their families, their lives. And in exchange, I'd get people I didn't know at all. It's not just about numbers, it's about trust. And when you lose that, it impacts everything. Sure, if someone had a problem soldier, they might send him my way, hoping for a better replacement. But that kind of thinking just shifts problems around instead of solving them. If I ever wrote a book about that time, a big part of it would focus on decisions like that. Decisions made far away from the battlefield that didn't match reality on the ground. Some of it felt like unnecessary complexity. Even our unit designations were confusing. My battalion was labeled in a way that matched pre-approved military records, even though we were essentially brand new units. I was leading a company within that structure, and despite having more command experience than most, flying hundreds of combat missions, I couldn't move up or command at a higher level because of technicalities. On top of that, my unit had dual designations. If someone got wounded, I had to track them under two different unit names because I never knew how they were processed during evacuation. That kind of administrative chaos made an already difficult job even harder. All of this should have been handled at higher levels. Instead, it became our burden in the field. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, and if I ever put it all into words, I'd probably call it a collection of decisions that didn't make sense to the people living through them. Then came 1965, during the early stages of major combat operations in Vietnam and the Battle at Ia Drang. I was in charge of aviation support during that time. The plan was to move one battalion into position and then bring in two more to block enemy movement near the Cambodian border. The goal was to trap opposing forces before they could retreat and regroup. But as often happens in war, things didn't go according to plan. The main fighting shifted unexpectedly. Instead of happening where we anticipated, it moved in a completely different direction. The enemy came down from the mountains and hit hard. The casualties were heavy, over 300 killed in just a few days. It wasn't just one location, it was across the entire engagement. At that point, it was one of the highest casualty rates since the Korean War. It was a brutal lesson, but we did learn from it. One of the biggest takeaways was the importance of trusting the people on the ground. When units are engaged, they need the freedom to respond immediately. If fire is coming from one direction, they need to be able to return fire without waiting for permission or worrying about boundaries. That kind of flexibility can mean the difference between survival and disaster. Unfortunately, we still struggled with that at times, giving commanders the authority they needed in the moment. At Ia Drang, the enemy forces came in aggressively and overwhelmed parts of our units. The intensity of that attack was unlike anything many had experienced before. The 1st Battalion inserted into the area held their ground under immense pressure, but another unit, moving across terrain to reposition, was hit even harder. The losses they suffered were devastating, some of the worst in that conflict. It was a harsh introduction to the realities of that war. Plans, strategies, and preparation all matter, but once you're in it, everything depends on how quickly you adapt, how well you trust your people, and how effectively you respond to the unexpected. Around the time we were trying to secure the landing zone after the B-52 strike, everything started to unravel. Just as the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry reached Albany, another B-52 strike hit LZ X-ray. The plan had been to send the 2nd of the 7th and the 1st of the 5th back in to finish things, but that never really happened the way we expected. The 2nd of the 7th took a devastating hit, around 155 killed and another 125 wounded. Losses like that shook everyone. It forced leadership to step back and admit we couldn't keep operating the same way. You just can't afford that kind of cost and expect to keep going. We were pulled back to regroup, reorganize, and rethink everything. One of the biggest lessons was simple, but hard to accept at the time. You've got to let the enemy move, and then hit them when you can do the most damage. If we'd been cleared to engage those troops coming off the hill, we could have brought everything down on them. Artillery, bombers, the works. But there was always this argument about whether they were technically inside Vietnam or across the border in Cambodia. From our perspective, that distinction didn't make much sense. I'd spent years studying maps before Vietnam, and even then you couldn't point to a clear line out there. It's dense jungle, no markers, no clear boundaries. Maybe a mountain ridge gives you a clue, but beyond that, it's all guesswork. Borders in places like that are more political than physical, and even countries in South America argue over jungle boundaries for the same reason. Rivers shift, terrain changes. Nobody can say with certainty where a line really is. When the casualties started coming in, there were attempts to evacuate the wounded, but the situation on the ground was brutal. At some point, orders came down from higher up that medevac helicopters were not to land in what they called hot zones. They wanted a green landing zone, meaning no enemy fire for at least 5 minutes. That never happened where we were. I ended up guiding two medevac helicopters in anyway, and that didn't sit well with their commander. That night he tracked me down, grabbed me while I was lying on my cot and started threatening me. For a moment I thought he was the enemy. I came up ready to defend myself. He was furious that I had led his crews into danger. But in my mind, if you're in command and you're telling your people not to go in and save wounded men, then you shouldn't be in that position. If those pilots had just followed their instincts and done what they knew was right, we could have evacuated a lot more people, and a lot faster. At one point, I even removed all the seats from the cargo area of my helicopter. There just wasn't any other way to carry the wounded properly. When the general asked me about it, I told him straight. Those infantry guys weren't sitting neatly strapped in during combat anyway. They'd be hanging off the sides, ready to jump out the second we touched down. I wasn't about to sit there under fire waiting for anyone to unbuckle a seatbelt. We had an understanding. They'd ride however they needed to, and I'd focus on getting the wounded out as fast as possible. Not long before that, you needed a general's approval just to take a seat out of a helicopter. That kind of thinking didn't match the reality we were dealing with. We kept going back into those hot zones, over and over again, because there was no other choice. On one run, I had 6 men shot off my aircraft, 3 dead, 3 wounded. My crew chief took a round through the throat. The infantry radio operator was killed. It was chaos. As I headed back, I knew that landing zone had turned into a nightmare. Enemy fire was coming from so close it felt like it was right outside the aircraft. The trees were tight, and we had to land right up against them. The enemy shooters were accurate too. They were hitting guys in the head as they came off the helicopter. On the way back in, I radioed ahead and told every aircraft commander I had to be ready when I landed. I canceled the rest of the incoming helicopters and sent them back. We didn't have enough ammo anyway. I figured 2 helicopters would be enough for what I had in mind, though that turned out to be an underestimate. When I got back, I gathered the pilots and asked for volunteers. I needed someone to fly cover with me. Going in alone wasn't enough anymore. If one bird went down, we needed another there to respond immediately, to mark the spot, lay down suppressive fire, and get people out. That's when Ed Freeman stepped forward. I already knew him. He'd been my superior back when we were stationed in Panama. Without hesitation, he volunteered to go back into that mess with me. Ed stepped up right away and said he'd take the mission. Honestly, he didn't want me going in at all. He told me to stay back and let him handle it. But that wasn't happening. I told him straight, I was the commander, and I needed to see for myself what was going on down there. He pushed back, said I should stay out of it, but I reminded him things had changed. Back in Panama, he'd been my superior. Now, I was in charge. He hadn't been promoted. I had. And even though he didn't have to serve under me, he chose to. We had a strong mutual respect, and no one else in the unit even knew about our history, or that he'd been passed over. In the end, he understood I was leading this, but he still insisted on coming along. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have taken him. He was one of the more experienced officers, and keeping him back might have made more sense. But instead of sending my third in command, I took Ed. He was a captain and my first platoon leader. My second platoon was led by another solid officer, and together we lifted off. As we headed out, I got on the radio with Moore. I'd been monitoring his communications the whole time, so I already had a good sense of how bad things were. You could hear it in the voices. Guys shouting that they were out of ammo, begging for reinforcements. But I wasn't about to send more troops into a landing zone where helicopters were getting torn apart. Out of the 8 aircraft we started with, only 4 were still operational, and even those were barely holding together. If a helicopter was leaking fuel or had damaged controls, we grounded it. But if it could still fly, we patched it up with whatever we had, sometimes just marking the new bullet holes with tape, and sent it right back out. I flew the same aircraft multiple times that day. One of them I took up 3 times, another twice. By the end of it, I'd logged around 22 flights on that one bird alone. And that's just what was recorded because my name was on the log that morning. In reality, we flew far more missions than that. The distance wasn't far, about 5 miles each way. That's roughly 2.5 minutes out, the same coming back. Add in a minute or 2 on the ground, and you're looking at maybe 7 or 8 minutes per round trip. It was constant movement, non-stop. Despite everything, we managed to evacuate over 70 wounded men who survived because of those flights. And I truly believe we could have saved many more if the medevac units had been allowed to do their job without restrictions. Later on, during my second tour, that policy changed. They dropped the requirement for a safe landing zone, and commanders started trusting their crews to make the call. That made a huge difference. It's frustrating, though, that lessons like that only come after people have already paid the price. You can train all you want, but nothing prepares you for the reality of combat. And making training as brutal as possible doesn't solve that. Pushing troops to exhaustion day and night, whether it's in the jungle or the desert, doesn't necessarily make them better, it just wears them down. Training should match the environment they'll be in, sure, but it shouldn't be about how much hardship you can pile on. That approach doesn't teach much. What we should have been doing is teaching practical skills. How to find and use resources, how to adapt. Show them where supply depots are, how to get equipment they'll actually need. If we'd known exactly where we were going ahead of time, I would have brought chainsaws, generators, whatever it took to make things easier and more efficient. I would have spent my own money on it if I had to. We needed that kind of equipment, but instead, we were stuck cutting through thick jungle with axes and machetes. At my level, a machete was the best tool we had. That's not the right way to operate. You've got to teach soldiers how to live smart, not just tough. There's a difference. And then there's the bigger picture. Some leaders get stuck thinking the goal is simply to rack up enemy casualties. That mindset is completely off. Counting bodies doesn't prove anything meaningful. It might look good on paper to someone sitting far away, but it doesn't reflect real success. We saw that kind of thinking in later conflicts too. When we destroyed entire columns of enemy forces, tanks, troops, everything, it didn't necessarily help us in the long run. If anything, it created more resentment, more anger. People saw it on television, and it just fueled hatred. Sometimes the better move is to bypass, to outmaneuver, to avoid unnecessary destruction. Not every soldier on the other side is someone you need to kill. The real targets are the leaders driving the conflict, not the average guy following orders. When the fighting ends, you actually need those people. They become the ones who help stabilize things, who take on roles in security and rebuilding. We've done it before. After World War II, leadership made the decision to rebuild rather than destroy. Former enemies became allies because we invested in rebuilding their economies and their societies. That's the kind of thinking that leads to long-term success. Because at the end of the day, if you kill someone's family, their friends, their people, you're not ending a conflict. You're planting the seeds for the next one. In the end, it wasn't rank, orders, or statistics that mattered. It was the choices made when everything was on the line. Real leadership meant stepping forward when others hesitated, protecting lives instead of counting losses, and learning hard truths in the middle of chaos. War taught that strength isn't just about force, but about judgment, humanity, and responsibility. And if there's one thing that stays with you, it's this. How you lead and what you value in those moments defines everything that comes after.